3:17 hours. Northern France, June 1944. A thin layer of cloud drifted across the moonlit sky as the dull vibration of 4 radial engines rolled through the darkness. 30,000 feet above the sleeping countryside, a formation of Allied bombers carved silent paths through the cold upper air. The propellers of dozens of aircraft shimmered in the moonlight, each blade cutting the thin atmosphere at nearly 270 miles per hour. Inside one of those bombers, the cockpit smelled of heated oil, hydraulic fluid, and the metallic tang of oxygen masks. Captain Daniel Mercer adjusted his gloves against the cold. Even with the heated flight suit, the temperature at this altitude hovered near minus 40 degrees Celsius. Frost clung to the cockpit windows. The aircraft around him were familiar shapes, sleek, heavy bombers whose reputations had already been carved into the skies over Europe. But Mercer's aircraft was different, very different. The engineers who had first tested it had laughed when they saw the blueprints. Some even said the same thing. This thing is stupid. From certain angles, it didn't even look like a proper bomber. The fuselage appeared too thick, the wings too long, the bomb bay too awkwardly shaped. Even the landing gear design had sparked arguments in engineering offices. Yet tonight, that same stupid aircraft was carrying a payload capable of erasing an entire airfield from existence. And in less than 20 minutes, it would prove every critic wrong. Inside the cockpit, Mercer leaned forward toward the instrument panel. The glow of red cockpit lights illuminated the rows of gauges. Manifold pressure steady. Oil temperature within limits. Propeller RPM locked perfectly. Behind him, the deep thunder of 4 Pratt & Whitney R 2800 double wasp engines pushed the bomber through the night sky with relentless power. Each engine produced nearly 2,000 horsepower, their massive 18-cylinder radial designs built for one thing: endurance. The aircraft itself was enormous. Wingspan, over 110 feet. Loaded weight, nearly 65,000 pounds. Yet despite its size, it moved faster than most bombers in the war. That speed was a result of design choice that many engineers initially thought was absurd. The bomber carried its weapons, not internally, but externally. Massive pylons beneath the wings carried specialized demolition bombs far larger than anything that could fit inside a traditional bomb bay. Aerodynamically, it looked wrong, messy, inefficient. But the engineers who defended the design understood something the critics did not. These bombs weren't meant for precision. They were meant for annihilation. Mercer checked the clock mounted above the navigation panel. 3:21 hours. 9 minutes to target. The intercom crackled. Navigator to pilot. Mercer pressed the transmit switch. Go ahead. A calm voice responded through the static. Crossing the Seine now. Target airfield bearing 085. Distance 15 miles. Mercer nodded. Copy that. Below them, the dark landscape of occupied France slid silently past. Fields, villages, rivers reflecting thin lines of moonlight, and somewhere ahead, a Luftwaffe airfield. The Germans had built it only months earlier. Satellite reconnaissance had revealed rows of hangars, fuel depots, and dozens of fighter aircraft stationed there. Fighters that could threaten the Allied invasion forces gathering across the English Channel. Destroying that airfield tonight meant removing a dagger pointed directly at the coming invasion, and Mercer's bomber carried the weapon designed to do it. In the bombardier's compartment, Lieutenant Robert Hayes adjusted the sighting optics of the Norden bomb site. The glass lens reflected faint starlight. Below him, the bomb bay controls waited silently. Except this aircraft didn't have a traditional bomb bay. Instead, the bombs hung beneath reinforced pylons under each wing. 2 massive 12,000-pound demolition bombs, each one packed with high explosives capable of collapsing reinforced concrete structures, if both detonated properly inside the airfield perimeter. The blast wave alone could destroy aircraft parked hundreds of feet away. Mercer shifted slightly in his seat. Even through the thick fuselage, he could feel the subtle changes in airflow as the bomber formation adjusted course. To the left, another aircraft drifted slightly closer. Moonlight illuminated its distinct silhouette. The pilot inside gave a brief wing waggle. Mercer responded with a nod, even though he knew the other pilot couldn't see it. Every aircraft in this formation had a specific role tonight, but Mercer's aircraft carried the heaviest ordnance of them all, and because of that, his aircraft would have to fly lower than the rest. Much lower, 324 hours. The radio crackled again. Lead to all aircraft. Beginning descent. Mercer pushed the control column forward slightly. The bomber's nose dipped. Altitude slowly began to fall. 30,000 feet. 28,000. 26,000. The air grew thicker. Engine noise deepened. And somewhere ahead, German radar operators were already watching their screens. Inside a Luftwaffe radar station near the coast, a technician leaned toward the glowing green display. A cluster of moving blips crept slowly across the screen. He frowned. The operator adjusted the signal amplification. More blips appeared. Dozens of them. His eyes widened. Flugzeug aircraft. Many aircraft. He grabbed the phone line connected to the nearby fighter command center. Within seconds, alarms began echoing across the German airfield ahead of Mercer's bomber formation. Floodlights flickered on. Ground crews sprinted across the tarmac. Mechanics pulled canvas covers off waiting fighter aircraft, and pilots ran toward their machines. Back in the Allied bomber formation, Mercer watched the altimeter tick downward, 20,000 feet. They were approaching the final attack corridor. The navigator's voice returned. Target 8 miles. Mercer tightened his grip on the controls. Soon, they would drop below the altitude where most bomber formations operated, because this aircraft, the one engineers once mocked, required something different. To deliver its enormous bombs accurately, it needed to get close, very close, and that meant flying straight toward the heart of the most dangerous airspace in northern France. 327 hours. The bombardier spoke quietly over the intercom. "I've got the airfield lights." Mercer glanced forward. On the horizon, faint clusters of light pierced the darkness. Runways, hangars, fuel storage tanks, and dozens of parked Luftwaffe fighters, all completely unaware of the weapon about to fall on them. But something else caught Mercer's attention. Thin white beams began slicing into sky. German searchlights. And seconds later, the first burst of anti-aircraft fire erupted beneath the formation. Black flak clouds blossomed in the moonlight. Mercer exhaled slowly. "All right, boys." He pushed the throttles forward. The 4 engines roared. "Let's show them what this stupid bomber can do." And far below, German fighters were already starting their engines. The bomber, now descending toward northern France, had not been welcomed warmly when it first appeared on drawing boards. In fact, during its earliest design meetings, several engineers openly questioned whether the aircraft should exist at all. It was unconventional, bulky, and by traditional bomber standards, deeply flawed. But the strange aircraft flying under Captain Daniel Mercer that night represented something far more important than elegance. It represented a brutal new idea about aerial warfare. Not precision, not surgical strikes, but overwhelming destructive force delivered with ruthless efficiency. The story of the aircraft began 3 years earlier. By that point in the war, Allied bombing doctrine was still evolving. Early strategic bombing missions had revealed a frustrating truth. Even large bomber formations struggled to destroy hardened targets like aircraft hangars, reinforced bunkers, and fuel depots. Standard high-explosive bombs could damage runways or lightly built structures. But airfields, especially those reinforced with concrete, were stubbornly resilient. You could hit an air base with hundreds of bombs and still leave enough intact infrastructure for enemy fighters to take off the next morning. Military planners needed something different, something heavier, something capable of cracking concrete and collapsing entire hangars in a single strike. The problem was simple. Most bombers couldn't carry bombs large enough to do that. Bomb bays had size limits, and the larger the bomb, the fewer aircraft could carry it. Engineers began experimenting with specialized demolition bombs weighing 10,000 pounds or more. But fitting such massive weapons inside traditional bomb bays proved nearly impossible. Bombers simply weren't designed to handle payloads at large. So one engineering team proposed a solution that many others immediately dismissed. Instead of redesigning bomb bays, why not hang the bombs outside the aircraft? To conventional aircraft designers, This sounded absurd. External bombs created enormous aerodynamic drag. Drag meant reduced speed. Reduced speed meant greater vulnerability to enemy fighters. Every rule of bomber design emphasized keeping weapons enclosed inside streamlined bomb bays. But the engineers proposing the new design had a different philosophy. Speed alone would not keep bombers safe. Altitude and firepower might. And if an aircraft was powerful enough, it could still move quickly even while carrying external payloads. So they began modifying an existing heavy bomber platform. The aircraft chosen for the experiment was a B-24 Liberator. The Liberator already had a reputation as a rugged workhorse of the Allied bomber fleet. Its high aspect ratio wings allowed long-range missions across Europe and the Pacific. Its Davis wing design produced excellent lift and fuel efficiency. And its four Pratt & Whitney R-1830 twin Wasp engines provided the power necessary to haul enormous payloads across vast distances. But to transform the aircraft into a demolition platform, significant changes were required. First came the pylons. Heavy reinforced mounting points were installed beneath each wing. These pylons were capable of carrying bombs far larger than anything normally used by bomber crews. Each mounting point was engineered to handle more than 12,000 pounds of explosive weight. The aircraft's structural frame had to be strengthened to support the stress. Additional bracing ran through the wing roots and fuselage spine. Fuel distribution systems were modified to balance the aircraft during release. Then came the most controversial change. The aircraft's bomb bay doors were partially removed. Instead of relying solely on internal storage, engineers optimized the aircraft for a mixed payload, some internal bombs, and some enormous demolition weapons hanging below the wings. The result looked awkward, even ridiculous. From certain angles, the aircraft appeared overloaded. Bombs protruded like massive metal tumors beneath the wings. Airflow patterns around the fuselage were disrupted. Drag increased dramatically. During early wind tunnel tests, the aircraft's drag coefficient rose by nearly 18% compared to a standard Liberator. One engineer famously muttered during the test review, "This thing flies like a brick with wings." Another reportedly said something even less flattering. "It's stupid." But numbers on paper rarely tell the full story. When the prototype finally flew, something surprising happened. Despite the drag, the aircraft remained stable. The Liberator's powerful engines compensated for the extra weight. Cruising speeds dropped slightly, but not enough to cripple the aircraft. More importantly, the bomber could now carry weapons that no other Allied aircraft could deliver in a single pass. Massive demolition bombs, concrete-piercing explosives, specialized high-capacity charges designed specifically for destroying hardened targets. And when those bombs detonated, the results were catastrophic. During one early test at a remote bombing range in Nevada, engineers dropped a prototype 12,000-pound demolition bomb on an abandoned concrete bunker complex. Observers watching from nearly a mile away reported feeling the shockwave ripple through the ground beneath them. The explosion pulverized the reinforced structures instantly. Concrete slabs weighing several tons were thrown hundreds of feet into the air. The blast crater measured nearly 90 feet across. Military observers present at the test quickly realized the aircraft's potential. A small formation of these modified bombers could destroy entire airfields, hangars, fuel depots, aircraft revetments, runways, everything, in one raid. But there was a catch. To deliver such enormous bombs accurately, the aircraft had to fly lower than typical high-altitude bomber formations. At extreme altitude, wind drift made targeting far less precise. A 12,000-pound bomb drifting off target by even a few hundred feet could miss its intended structure, so demolition bombers often descended to 15,000 feet or lower during the attack run, and that meant flying directly into the most dangerous zone of enemy defenses. Flak batteries were deadliest at those altitudes, and German fighter interceptors could climb into attack position much faster. The aircraft's unusual payload also affected maneuverability. Those massive bombs hanging beneath the wings changed the aircraft's center of gravity. Sharp turns became sluggish. Rapid climbs were slower. Until the bombs were released, the aircraft carried its vulnerability with it. That vulnerability was exactly what worried the engineers. But the bomber crews who eventually flew the modified aircraft had a different perspective. They understood that the aircraft's mission wasn't to dodge every threat. Its mission was simple: get to the target, drop the bombs, destroy everything below, and escape before the enemy could recover. Which brought the story back to the cold night sky over France. 3:28 hours. Captain Daniel Mercer's aircraft continued its descent, 15,000 feet. The bomber formation around him began spreading slightly. Standard bombers would remain higher, but Mercer's aircraft, the one carrying the giant demolition bombs, continued downward, 12,000 feet. Below them, the German airfield was now clearly visible. Rows of hangars, fuel trucks, aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip. The Luftwaffe base was bustling with sudden activity as alarms echoed across the runway. Searchlights swept the sky. Anti-aircraft guns roared. And somewhere inside hardened bunkers, German radar officers were issuing desperate orders. But the greatest danger had not yet arrived, because less than 20 miles away, German fighter pilots were already climbing into the night sky, and within minutes, they would find Mercer's bomber. The strange bomber engineers once called stupid, the bomber carrying enough explosive power to erase their airfield in a single strike. 3:29 hours. Northern France. Captain Daniel Mercer leveled the bomber at 11,800 feet below the aircraft. The German airfield now stretched across the landscape like a glowing island in the darkness. Runway lamps burned dim through blackout shields. Maintenance trucks scattered across the tarmac. Several aircraft already had engines turning, propellers flickering beneath harsh floodlights. The Luftwaffe knew something was coming. They just didn't know how devastating it would be. Inside the cockpit, Mercer's gloved hand rested lightly on the throttles. The vibration of the four engines pulsed through the control column, a steady mechanical heartbeat, pushing the massive bomber forward at 245 miles per hour. He glanced at the altimeter again. Lower than standard bomber altitude, lower than most crews liked. But the giant demolition bombs hanging beneath his wings demanded it. The navigator's voice came through the intercom. 6 miles to target. Mercer acknowledged with a brief click of the transmitter. Behind him, the bomber's crew moved through practice routines. In the nose compartment, Bombardier Lieutenant Robert Hayes leaned over the Norden bomb site, carefully aligning the crosshairs with the glowing runway grid below. The bomb site's gyroscopic stabilizer hummed quietly, compensating for the aircraft's motion. Hayes adjusted the targeting knobs. Wind speed, ground drift, altitude, aiming point, central hangar complex. If the bombs landed there, the shock wave would ripple across the entire airfield. Fuel trucks, ammunition storage, aircraft lined wingtip to wingtip. Everything would be caught inside the blast radius. But the bomber still had to survive the approach. The first warning came from the tail gunner. Movement below. Mercer's eyes flicked to the side window. 2 faint streaks of light rose from the horizon. Then 4. Then 6. German aircraft climbing hard. Within seconds, their navigation lights disappeared. Combat blackout. The interceptors were closing. At the same moment, 20 miles away, inside a Luftwaffe fighter bunker, the scramble alarm screamed through concrete corridors. Pilots ran for their aircraft. Mechanics yanked wheel chocks aside. Fuel lines were ripped free. And along the runway, engines roared to life. The first fighters belonged to Messerschmitt Bf 109 unit stationed at the airfield. Fast, climbing quickly, deadly in the hands of experienced pilots. The Bf 109's Daimler-Benz DB605 engine produced over 1,450 horsepower, capable of pushing the fighter to more than 390 miles per hour. And more importantly, it could reach Mercer's altitude in minutes. Behind them, heavier interceptors joined the scramble. Twin-engine fighters from a nearby base thundered down the runway. The Messerschmitt Bf 110 had been designed specifically to hunt bombers. With long endurance and heavy armament, they were deadly against large aircraft, cannons, machine guns, and pilots trained to attack from blind angles. Back in Mercer's bomber, the radio operator spoke urgently. Radar chatters increasing. Germans know we're here. Mercer nodded. They always do. What mattered now was timing. The bomber needed just a few minutes inside the target zone. A straight approach, bomb release, then a hard turn west toward the English Channel. But every second spent over the airfield increased the chance of interception. 3:31 hours. The first flak shell burst directly ahead of the formation. A violent black cloud exploded in the sky. The aircraft shuddered as the shock wave passed. "Flak at 12 o'clock, shouted the co-pilot. Moments later, the sky erupted. Anti-aircraft batteries around the airfield had locked onto the formation. Heavy 88mm guns fired in rapid sequence. Each shell climbed toward the bombers before detonating into lethal fragments. Thousands of steel shards ripped through the air. Even a near miss could tear through wings, engines, or cockpit glass. Mercer held the bomber steady. If he began evasive maneuvers now, the bombardier would lose his targeting solution. Straight and level. That was the rule during the bombing run, even under flak. For miles to target, the navigator called. The bombardier responded calmly. "I see the hangars." Below them, the German airfield had transformed into chaos. Ground crews ran across the tarmac. Searchlights swung upward, stabbing beams through the clouds. One beam caught the edge of the bomber formation. Another followed, then another. Suddenly, Mercer's aircraft was bathed in white light. "Searchlights on us," the tail gunner yelled. Mercer cursed under his breath. The moment searchlights locked onto a bomber, flak batteries could calculate firing solutions far more accurately. The explosions around them intensified. Black bursts appeared closer, louder. One shell detonated barely 200 feet off the bomber's right wing. The aircraft jolted violently. Warning lights flickered on the instrument panel. But the engines held. Then the tail gunner shouted again. "Fighters!" 6 o'clock low. Mercer twisted in his seat. Dark shapes were climbing toward them from behind. Fast. Even in the dim moonlight, their silhouettes were unmistakable. The narrow wings, the pointed noses, German interceptors. One of them flashed past the lower cloud layer, revealing the angular profile of a Focke-Wulf FW-190. The FW-190 was one of the most dangerous fighters in the Luftwaffe arsenal. Powered by a BMW 801 radial engine, it could reach speeds of 408 miles per hour and carry devastating firepower. For 20mm cannons and heavy machine guns, against a slow bomber, it was lethal. Gunners ready, Mercer ordered. The bomber's defensive turrets rotated. Top turret, ball turret, tail guns. Each crew member scanned the darkness through armored glass. The first fighter attack came quickly. A Bf-109 climbed steeply from below, its nose flashing with gunfire. Bright orange tracers streaked upward. The ball turret gunner reacted instantly. Twin, 50 caliber machine guns roared, sending a stream of bullets toward a climbing interceptor. The fighter broke away sharply, disappearing beneath the bomber. But more were coming. Through the side window, Mercer saw two additional fighters approaching from the right. Their silhouettes cut through the moonlight, closing fast. Inside the bombardier's compartment, Hayes didn't look up. He kept his eye pressed against the bomb site. The crosshairs drifted slowly toward the center of the airfield. Hangars filled the lens. Rows of parked aircraft. Fuel tanks. Everything perfectly aligned. But the bomber still had to fly straight for another minute. 1 minute inside a storm of flak and incoming fighters. Behind the bomber, another interceptor surged upward. This time was a FW-190, climbing aggressively toward the bomber's vulnerable underside. The ball turret gunner saw it first. Bandit coming up fast. The turret rotated. Machine guns opened fire. Tracer rounds sliced through the darkness. But the fighter kept climbing. Closer, closer. Its cannons flashed. 20mm shells streaked toward the bomber. One round slammed into the wing root. Another exploded near the tail. The aircraft shook violently. Warning alarms blared. But Mercer refused to turn, because directly ahead, the airfield was now filling the bombardier site, and the massive demolition bombs beneath the wings were seconds away from release. "Pilot," Hayes said quietly. "Bomb site locked." Mercer exhaled slowly. But before he could respond, the tail gunner shouted again. More fighters. Multiple contacts. From the darkness behind them, a full squadron of German interceptors was now racing toward the bomber formation, and Mercer's aircraft, heavy with demolition bombs, was directly in their path. 3:32 hours. Altitude, 11,700 feet. Speed, 246 miles per hour. Captain Daniel Mercer gripped the control column as another violent burst of flak erupted just off the bomber's left wing. The explosion flashed bright orange in the night sky. Fragments rattled against the fuselage like a storm of metal hail. Inside the cockpit, warning lights flickered across the instrument panel. The bomber shuddered, but the four engines continued their steady thunder. Mercer forced himself not to react. Not yet. Turning now would ruin the bombing run. And that meant the entire mission, the entire reason this aircraft existed, would fail. Ahead of him, the German airfield spread across the darkness. The runway grid, the hangar complexes, fuel depots clustered near the taxiways. The target was perfectly visible now. Too visible. Searchlights swept across the sky in frantic arcs. One beam slid across the bomber's left wing. Another snapped upward from the edge of the airfield. Suddenly, three separate beams converged on Mercer's aircraft. White light flooded the cockpit. They were fully illuminated. "Searchlights locked!" the co-pilot shouted. Mercer muttered under his breath. "Hold steady." Behind the bomber, the German fighters were closing rapidly. The first attackers were from the fast-climbing squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf 109 that had scrambled only minutes earlier. Their pilots had already spotted the bomber, singled out by the searchlights. To them, Mercer's aircraft looked like an easy kill, a large silhouette, lower altitude, heavy payload, and flying straight. Exactly the kind of target fighter pilots were trained to destroy. One Bf 109 surged forward to the darkness, its engine screaming at full power. The pilot lined up the bomber's tail. Distance closing, 800 meters. His gun sights centered on the illuminated fuselage. Then he squeezed the trigger. Inside the tail turret, Staff Sergeant William Carter saw the flashes instantly. Bandit firing. The tail guns roared. Twin, 50 caliber Browning machine guns erupted in a stream of bright tracer fire. Bullets streaked backward through the night. The German fighter suddenly veered left, diving away to avoid the defensive fire. But the attack had already begun. More fighters surged forward behind it. Mercer kept the bomber steady, eyes fixed on the instruments. Altitude stable. Engine temperatures holding. The massive demolition bombs still hung beneath the wings, altering the aircraft's balance with their enormous weight. Until those bombs were gone, maneuvering was limited. Sharp turns could overstress the pylons. And if the bomber rolled too aggressively, the bombs could tear free. Another fighter climbed toward them. This one approached from below and slightly to the right. Its broad wings and thick radial engine cowling revealed the unmistakable silhouette of Focke-Wulf FW-190. The FW-190 was heavily armed and built for brutal firepower. Its four 20mm MG-151 cannons could shred bomber armor in seconds. The German pilot knew exactly where to aim. The bomber's wing roots, the fuel tanks, or the cockpit. He pushed the throttle forward and climbed aggressively. Inside the belly of the bomber, the ball turret gunner spun his spherical turret toward the incoming fighter. The rotating glass dome offered a terrifying view of the sky below. Nothing but darkness and distant explosions. Then the fighter appeared. Fast. Dead center. Got him. The turret guns opened fire. Twin streams of tracer rounds slashed downward. The FW-190 pilot jerked the control stick violently, rolling sideways to avoid the fire. The tracers passed just beneath his wings. But he fired anyway. His cannons flashed. Explosive rounds streaked toward the bomber. One shell slammed into the lower fuselage. Another exploded near the left engine nacelle. The bomber lurched. Inside the cockpit, Mercer felt the shock vibrate through the control column. Warning gauges flickered again. "Engine 3 took a hit," the flight engineer shouted. Mercer glanced at the engine instruments. Oil pressure was dropping slightly, but the engine was still running. "Keep watching it," Mercer ordered. Ahead of them, the airfield loomed closer. 3:33 hours. Distance, 2 miles. The bombardier's voice remained calm. Steady, steady. Mercer held the controls firm. This was the most dangerous phase of the entire mission. The final bombing run. Straight and level. No evasive maneuvers. Even as flak and fighters closed in, behind the bomber formation, heavier interceptors were now entering the fight. Twin-engine fighters from nearby bases had finally climbed to altitude. The long silhouettes belonged to Messerschmitt Bf-110 units. Unlike the single-engine fighters, the Bf-110 carried devastating frontal armament, two 20mm cannons, for machine guns, sometimes even additional rockets designed to destroy bomber formations. Their pilots specialized in attacking from distance, firing heavy weapons before breaking away. One Bf-110 lined up behind Mercer's aircraft. The pilot squeezed his trigger. A burst of cannon shells streaked forward. Inside the bomber, the tailgunner saw them too late. The shells slammed into the rear fuselage. Metal tore open. One round shattered part of the tail stabilizer. The aircraft lurched violently. Carter gritted his teeth and returned fire. His tracers reached the Bf-110, forcing the German pilot to break away. But the damage had been done. Tails hit. Carter shouted. Mercer could feel it. The bomber's controls felt heavier, sluggish, still flyable, but not forgiving. Pilot, Hayes said quietly from the nose, "I'm almost there." Mercer looked forward. The runway grid of the airfield now filled the windscreen. Hangars stood clearly visible. Rows of Luftwaffe fighters sat exposed across the tarmac. Fuel trucks scattered in panic. Ground crews running for cover. The target was perfect, but the sky around them had become a storm of explosions. Flak bursts detonated at nearly the same altitude. Searchlights kept the bomber pinned in bright white beams, and enemy fighters continued closing from multiple directions. Another FW-190 dove from above, cannons blazing. The top turret gunner fired back immediately. Tracer fire crossed the night sky. The German fighter rolled sharply, barely avoiding the stream of bullets. It passed directly over the bomber, so close Mercer could see the black cross markings on its wings. Inside the bombardier's compartment, Hayes adjusted the bomb sight slightly. Wind drift correction. Final targeting alignment. The giant demolition bombs beneath the wings were now only seconds away from release. But the aircraft still needed a few more moments of steady flight. Just a little longer. Behind the bomber, yet another interceptor began its attack run. This time the German pilot had chosen a different tactic. Instead of climbing toward the bomber, he was diving straight down. A high-speed attack from above. Cannons ready. Gun sights centered on the bomber's cockpit. Inside the nose compartment, Hayes suddenly spoke. "Pilot, stand by." Mercer tightened his grip on the controls. Flak burst again ahead of them. Searchlights held steady. Fighters closing fast. And the demolition bombs were finally ready to fall. But the attacking interceptor above them was already diving into firing range. The next few seconds would decide everything. The mission, the bomber, an entire German airfield waiting below. 334 hours. Altitude, 11,600 feet. Airspeed, 244 miles per hour. The night sky above the German airfield had become a violent storm of explosions, tracer fire, and screaming engines. Captain Daniel Mercer barely noticed the chaos anymore. His entire focus was locked on one task. Hold the bomber steady. Inside the nose compartment, Lieutenant Robert Hayes remained motionless over the Norden bomb site. The gyroscopic stabilizer hummed as the site compensated for wind drift and vibration. Through the lens, the entire airfield now filled the targeting frame. Runways, hangars, rows of aircraft parked wing to wing. Fuel trucks scattered across the tarmac. The crosshairs slowly drifted toward the central maintenance complex. That was the aim point. If the bombs landed there, the blast would ripple across the entire installation. But the bomber still needed 5 more seconds of steady flight. 5 seconds inside the most dangerous airspace in northern France. Above the bomber, the diving interceptor was already lining up its attack. The German pilot had chosen the most vulnerable point, the cockpit. His aircraft was a Focke-Wulf FW-190, one of the most lethal interceptors in the Luftwaffe arsenal. The fighter screamed downward at nearly 400 miles per hour, its BMW 801 radio engine howling in the thin night air. The pilot centered his gun sight on the bomber's nose. Distance closing rapidly, 300 meters. His thumb tightened on the trigger. Inside Mercer's cockpit, the co-pilot suddenly shouted, "Bandit diving, 12 o'clock high." Mercer glanced upward just long enough to see the dark shape of the FW-190 plunging toward them. Cannons ready. Muzzle flashes beginning to flicker. But Mercer didn't move. He couldn't. Turning even slightly would ruin the bombardier solution. And if the bombs missed their target, the entire mission would be wasted. So he held the aircraft perfectly level. Inside the nose compartment, Hayes whispered quietly. Almost. The crosshairs centered on the hangar complex. Wind drift corrected. Altitude locked. Ground speed confirmed. Everything aligned. The FW-190 pilot fired. 4 20-millimeter cannons erupted simultaneously. Bright streaks of explosive shells tore through the darkness toward the bomber's cockpit. At the same instant, the top turret gunner reacted. Twin, 50 caliber machine guns roared upward. Tracer rounds ripped across the sky. The streams of fire intersected. Explosive shells passed dangerously close to the cockpit glass. One round slammed into the bomber's right wing. Another detonated just behind the cockpit. The aircraft jolted violently, but Mercer held the controls steady. Bombs away. Hayes slammed the release switch. With a thunderous mechanical jolt, the giant demolition bombs separated from the reinforced pylons beneath the wings. 2 massive 12,000-pound demolition bombs dropped into the darkness below. For a brief moment, the bomber seemed to leap upward as the enormous weight vanished. Mercer immediately pulled the control column left. Turning, the aircraft banked hard toward the west, but the bombs were already falling. Below them, gravity pulled the massive weapons toward the heart of the German airfield. Each bomb weighed more than some small aircraft. Their steel casings cut silently through the night air. 11,000 feet, 9,000, 7,000. No warning, no sound reaching the ground crews below. Only 2 dark shapes falling toward the hangar complex. On the runway, several Luftwaffe mechanics were still trying to move aircraft into protective revetments. One of them looked up. He saw nothing at first. Then something enormous flashed past the floodlights above. His eyes widened, but there was no time to react. The first bomb struck. The impact detonated over 5,000 pounds of high explosive. For a split second, the ground seemed to vanish. A blinding flash erupted across the center of the airfield. Then the shockwave arrived. Concrete hangars disintegrated instantly. Walls collapsed outward in a storm of pulverized debris. Aircraft parked near the blast were thrown into the air like toys. Fuel trucks erupted into fireballs. The explosion carved a massive crater, nearly 90 feet wide, into the runway complex. The second bomb struck less than a second later. This one landed directly beside a cluster of fuel storage tanks. The detonation was even more catastrophic. The initial explosion ruptured multiple fuel reservoirs simultaneously. A chain reaction followed. Thousands of gallons of aviation fuel ignited in an instant. A towering column of fire shot hundreds of feet into the sky. The blast wave expanded outward across the entire airfield. Hangars collapsed. Aircraft disintegrated. Windows shattered miles away in nearby villages. From the air, the entire base seemed to vanish beneath a rolling wall of flame. Inside Mercer's bomber, the crew felt the shock wave slam into the aircraft even at altitude. The cockpit windows flashed bright orange. For a moment, the entire landscape below became a single expanding inferno. The co-pilot stared in disbelief. My God! Below them, the German airfield was no longer recognizable. Where hangars had stood seconds earlier, there were only burning craters. Rows of fighters were gone. Fuel depots erupted in secondary explosions. The runway itself had been shattered. Flames spread across the tarmac in rivers of burning fuel. But the danger was far from over. The German fighters were still there, and now they were furious. One Messerschmitt Bf 109 surged toward Mercer's bomber from the right. The pilot had seen the explosions. He knew what had just happened, and he wanted revenge. He lined up the bomber's damaged tail and fired. Machine gun round streaked toward the aircraft. Inside the tail turret, Carter fired back immediately. Tracers crossed the sky. The German fighter rolled sharply to avoid the stream of bullets. But another interceptor was already approaching, this time from below. A Messerschmitt Bf-110 climbed toward the bomber's underside. Its nose cannons flashed. Explosive shells slammed into the lower fuselage. The aircraft shuddered violently. Warning alarms screamed across the cockpit panel. Hydraulics pressure dropping, the flight engineer yelled. Mercer clenched his jaw. They had delivered the bombs. Now they had to survive the escape. He shoved the throttles forward. The 4 engines roared at maximum power. The bomber accelerated westward toward the dark horizon. Behind them, the German airfield burned like a miniature sun. But the interceptors weren't giving up. More fighters were climbing through the smoke. Angry, determined, and Mercer's damaged bomber still had to fly nearly 120 miles to reach the safety of the English Channel. The sky ahead was empty, but behind them, the hunt had only just begun. 3:36 hours. Northern France. Captain Daniel Mercer pushed the throttles as far forward as they would go. The 4 radial engines roared in protest, their deep mechanical thunder vibrating to the battered fuselage. The bomber surged westward, struggling to gain speed after releasing the enormous demolition bombs. Without the massive weight hanging beneath its wings, the aircraft felt different, lighter, more responsive, but was also damaged. Inside the cockpit, warning lights continued flashing across the instrument panel. Engine 3 still showed fluctuating oil pressure. Hydraulic pressure was dropping slowly, and the tail assembly, partially shredded by cannon fire, vibrated violently in the slipstream. Mercer glanced at the altimeter. 11,200 feet. The aircraft had lost several hundred feet during the turn. He pulled gently on the control column, coaxing the bomber back into a shallow climb. Navigator. Mercer said into the intercom, "Distance to the coast?" A pause. Then the reply came. "About 90 miles. 90 miles of hostile airspace." And German fighters were still closing in behind them. The tail gunner's voice cracked over the intercom. "2 bandits still with us." Mercer didn't need to look back. He already knew what they were facing. The surviving interceptors from the shattered airfield were furious. The destruction they had just witnessed below was unimaginable. From the cockpit windows, Mercer could still see the glow of the burning base behind them. What had once been a functioning Luftwaffe airfield was now an expanding sea of fire. Hangars flattened, runways shattered, fuel depots detonating one after another, and dozens of aircraft destroyed where they had stood. But revenge was already climbing through the night sky. One of the interceptors was a Messerschmitt Bf-109, still fast despite the chaos behind it. Its pilot had avoided the bombing zone entirely, launching from a nearby auxiliary strip moments after the explosions. He pushed the aircraft hard, closing the distance on Mercer's bomber. Speed, nearly 380 miles per hour. The fighter rapidly gained on the damaged bomber. Inside the tail turret, Staff Sergeant William Carter tracked the approaching silhouette. The fighter's shape was unmistakable. Narrow wings, sharp nose. He centered the gun sight. Come on. The German pilot opened fire first. Streams of 7, 92 millimeters machine gun. Rounds streaked toward the bomber. Several rounds struck the tail assembly. The aircraft shuddered again. But Carter fired back instantly. Twin, 50 caliber Browning machine guns roared. The sky between the aircraft filled with tracer fire. The German pilot rolled sharply to the right to avoid the incoming stream. One tracer clipped the fighter's wing. Another struck the engine cowling. The Bf-109 suddenly jerked sideways, trailing faint smoke. Its pilot broke off the attack and dove away into the darkness. But the second interceptor was far more dangerous. It was larger, heavier, and far more heavily armed. The silhouette climbing beneath Mercer's bomber belonged to a Messerschmitt Bf-110. Unlike the Bf-109, the Bf-110 specialized in destroying bombers. Its nose-mounted cannons could tear apart large aircraft with brutal efficiency. The German pilot approached cautiously. He knew the bomber's defensive guns could still reach him. Instead of attacking from behind, he climbed slowly into the bomber's blind spot beneath the tail. Inside the cockpit, Mercer felt the aircraft vibrating more violently now. The damaged tail section was beginning to create serious drag. The bomber struggled to maintain altitude. "Engineer," Mercer said, "how's engine 3? The reply came quickly. "Still running, but she's hurting." Mercer nodded grimly. They needed every bit of power to reach the coast. Suddenly the ball turret gunner shouted, "Contact below." The BF-110 had appeared directly beneath the bomber. Its nose cannons flashed. Heavy 20mm shells streaked upward. 2 rounds slammed into the bomber's lower fuselage. 1 tore through part of the wing root. The aircraft jolted violently. Inside the cockpit, warning alarms screamed. Fuel pressure fluctuated. Mercer fought the controls as the bomber dipped suddenly. "Return fire," he shouted. The ball turret rotated instantly. Twin 50 caliber guns opened fire. Tracer rounds ripped downward toward the climbing interceptor. The German pilot tried to break away, but he had come too close. Several bullets struck the BF-110's left engine. Sparks erupted along the wing. Then smoke began pouring from the engine nacelle. The fighter rolled sharply. For a moment it seemed like the pilot might recover, but the damaged engine caught fire. Flames spread along the wing root. The aircraft spiraled downward into the darkness below. Inside Mercer's bomber, the crew remained silent for a moment. The sky behind them had finally cleared. No more interceptors. No more tracer fire. Only the distant glow of the burning airfield far behind them. 3:49 hours. Altitude, 10,900 feet. The navigator's voice returned. "Channel in 15 minutes. Mercer exhaled slowly. For the first time since the bombing run began, the sky ahead was empty. The bomber formation had scattered during the attack, but several aircraft were now visible ahead. Dark silhouettes moving toward the safety of the English Channel. Mercer guided the damaged bomber toward them. Behind them, the Luftwaffe airfield continued to burn. Reconnaissance aircraft would later confirm the scale of the destruction. Over 40 German aircraft destroyed. Multiple hangars obliterated. Fuel reserves completely detonated. Runways cratered beyond immediate repair. The airfield would remain inoperable for weeks. And that meant dozens of German fighters that might have threatened Allied operations over the English Channel would never take flight. In the months that followed, the unusual bomber design would gain a new reputation. The engineers who once mocked its strange external bomb mounts stopped calling it stupid. They started calling it something else. Effective, because the concept had proven something vital. Sometimes the most unconventional designs were the ones that changed the battlefield. As dawn slowly approached over the channel, Mercer's bomber limped toward home. The crew was exhausted, cold, and painfully aware of how close they had come to not returning. But the mission had succeeded. The giant demolition bombs had done exactly what they were designed to do. They had erased an entire airfield in a single raid. Years later, historians would still discuss raids like Mercer's. Moments when engineering risk, pilot courage, and brutal wartime necessity combined into something extraordinary. Because on that cold night in 1944, one strange bomber, the aircraft engineers once laughed at, had turned an entire German airfield into a crater of fire, and proved that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in the sky was the one nobody believed in.